Time to take a look at what's grabbing international headlines. I'm joined by Deeptika Laurent in the studio. Good morning, Deepti. You're starting out with a spat between Theresa May and Jean-Claude Juncker.
Well, the fallout continues between those two. The British Prime Minister Theresa May is on the back foot this after details of her meeting last Wednesday with Jean-Claude Juncker were leaked and revealed to the German newspaper Frankfurter Allgemeiner. Basically, the paper called it a disastrous dinner party. That's how they're calling it. The British paper The Guardian reports that Theresa May is essentially facing accusations of a botched and humiliating start to Brexit talks. At the heart of this dispute, Delano, Juncker's insistence that the UK foot the estimated $60 billion bill for what they essentially call the divorce bill, and Theresa May telling him that the UK doesn't owe Europe a single penny. Juncker's last words to the Prime Minister as he left London last week were, I quote, "I'm leaving Downing Street 10 times more skeptical than I was before."
To be a fly on the wall at that dinner, seriously. Now, not everyone thinks Theresa May is at fault.
Well, the Telegraph has actually come in really in favor of her today. The Conservative Daily says what allegedly surprised Juncker the most is that May said the deal on the fate of British citizens post-Brexit, which is really the key issue of Brexit, could be struck by the end of June, and he was completely shocked by her optimism. Yet, the Telegraph says she had made the same comments to Donald Tusk a few weeks earlier, the European Council president, and Juncker sort of acted as if he wasn't aware of it. Essentially, the newspaper is accusing EU leaders of playing petty games in revenge for the UK's decision to leave Europe. Now, The Independent comes in much harsher, though, against May. In an editorial today, the paper says she's, quote, laboring under the illusion that she has bargaining powers. This will lead to national disaster because the uncomfortable truth is that the UK needs Europe more than Europe needs the UK.
We'll see what happens in the election next month. Now, moving on to a more imminent election here in France. Of course, this Sunday, voting begins in the second round. Emmanuel Macron, who's become the favorite, versus Marine Le Pen.
And Le Soir, the Belgian paper, is looking at Marine Le Pen and basically looking at all the great pains she's taken to show the, quote, approachability of her party. That's what they say on their front page here. This by obviously opening the doors to Nicolas Dupont-Aignan, who previously belonged to the Conservative Party in France. For the Belgian paper Le Soir, though, the party is still imprinted by its far-right anti-immigrant DNA.
Now, the website Politico has been looking at Emmanuel Macron and the similarities he has with another French president.
I got to say, Politico have got some great coverage, and this is a really interesting story on the French election. They talk about the story of a brilliant technocrat who breaks with establishment to form his own party and ride a wave of optimism to the Élysée. Well, this is not just Emmanuel Macron's story, but it is also that of Valéry Giscard D'Estaing, who became president in 1974 at the age of 48 and essentially swept through changes that broke with the old establishment at the time. But Politico says this should come as a warning to Macron because Giscard d'Estaing's attempt to create, I quote, a centrist third force ultimately foundered on the rocks of the left-right divide. Essentially, the idea of being centrist alienated both the left and right. And they say, at least for Macron, the stakes are higher because if he fails, well, he'll be opening rich territory to the Front National, the far-right party in France in the future.
Exactly, he will. Now, moving on to Russia next, where police have detained gay rights protesters at a May Day rally, May Day parade.
That's right. The New York Times reports that several arrests were made after that rally. It's really one of the first demonstrations we've seen inside of Russia in support of homosexuals who are being tortured and persecuted in the southern region of Chechnya. Anger and shock has been building, and the New York Times reports that there were these arrests on the sidelines of that protest yesterday. The website Salon, which is kind of like a webzine, has penned an interesting piece that looks at how Vladimir Putin essentially laid the ground for this persecution to take place because, of course, he ushered in a lot of anti-LGBT propaganda. He cracked down on their rights. And according to Salon, I quote, one person says, when Putin came to power in 2013, gay people in Russia were suddenly treated like enemies of the state.
It's really tragic what's happening there. And let's end on something a little different now. American rapper Ja Rule, whose name I haven't heard in probably a decade or so. Him and his partner are facing a $100 million lawsuit.
Well, this is probably not the reason he'd want his name to be back in the media after all these years, Delano. It comes from the botched Fyre Festival, what was supposed to be a luxury music festival in the Bahamas for the beautiful and rich, Instagrammed to death, turned into a nightmare after people forked out tens of thousands of dollars only to arrive and find there was nothing but tents and portable toilets, as you see in this picture here. They were stranded on the island. They were fed only ham and cheese sandwiches, allegedly. Anyway, the promoters say they were overwhelmed by the organization of the festival. Now, Ja Rule and his partner are facing a $100 million class action suit. Astonishingly, they've said they would offer full refunds or, I quote, the option to get extra VIP passes to next year's event.
Extra.
That hasn't been announced yet.
Oh, we'll see what happens. Thank you very much. Deepika Lohan there with a look at the international papers.